So now let's look at assigning shaders to our object. So I've just got a simple light setup, just one area light, casting a light from the upper left. On here you can see the render quality is fairly poor, really noisy shadows. Here are my render settings right now under the Arnold renderer. I've got my camera anti-aliasing set to very low value of 2, everything else set to 1. I could set that to 0, some of these to 0. But I'm not too worried about the render quality right now. I just want to see fast renders. So excuse that, but understand where this is coming from. So if we select the object and assign a new shader, now I should say with the Arnold render view, you can actually select objects here. So you can see I'm clicking, I'm selecting the floor, clicking, selecting the statue. So you can actually select things in the Arnold render view. But now I want to assign a shader to this. So I'm just going to right click and go down to assign new material. It brings up all the possible options. We've got Maya shaders, we've got Arnold shaders, and I actually have another renderer installed here called Redshift, but we're just going to stick to Arnold. So if we click on under Arnold where it says shader, you have all these things that start with AI. Now if you see something in my menu that starts with AL, that's because I've got a set of third-party shaders that somebody designed. And I used to use these more in Arnold 4, but now Arnold 5 has this one shader called the AiStandardSurface, which does a lot of the things that the AL surface used to do. So the AL surface was a third-party shader, and in some ways it worked better than the Arnold standard shader. But now the AiStandardSurface, AI for Arnold standard surface, works great. There are some render nodes from the AL suite that I still use, but I'm going to try and not use them here and just stick to the standard default Arnold things that start with AI rather than AL. Anyway, so we'll select the AiStandardSurface. You can see there are some different things here, but this one is sort of the workhorse, and you can turn it into a lot of different things. So you can see that as soon as I put that on, when we switch from the Lambert shader, the most noticeable thing is that it's specular, it's shiny, it seems to have a glossy surface. And that's because the default settings for the AI standard surface has specular turned up. So I've talked about these things a little bit more, but I want a little bit earlier in an earlier video, but I want to talk about these things again. So for the different attributes, you'll often see this, or sorry, the different settings, you'll see this attribute weight, and this is to indicate how much of this suite of attributes is returned to the viewer, or how much this influences the local surface qualities or color. So the base means the diffuse color, so without specular. So let's turn specular off. And so we just go back to what looks like our Lambert, except it's set to white rather than mid-gray. But if I just turn to this, then we essentially have that Lambert shader. The weight is set to 0.8, so the incidental light source comes down, strikes the surface, and returns light to the viewer. And you see the scene through the camera, but it's only returning 80% of that color. So if I turn this to 0.1, then we're only getting 10% of this color returned to us. It's the idea that it's maybe being absorbed or whatever. We set this to 1, then where we get no shadow, then we should get a true representation of this color. We can turn up roughness, and this gives it sort of more of a satiny sort of view. It spreads that color out into the shadows a bit, or a velvety sort of view, I should say. So let's just leave this at 1, and then specular, we can turn this up to 1, and you can see it makes an overlay of sort of shininess. So whereas before it looked like a matte finish just something with a matte finish, like a plaster that has no shininess, if we turn up specular, then we get shininess. Now specular is reflectivity of the light source. Okay? So if we turn this, if we change the color here, then it's going to influence the color of that reflection. We could also do this by changing the color of the light source, but then the diffuse color would actually be changed on the object as well. So this allows you to change the specular color here. Roughness means about how tight or broad the specular is. So if I turn this to 0, then we should have perfectly sharp speculars. If we start to turn this up, then they start to soften, and you can change the quality of the material. So now it doesn't look like a totally matte plaster right now, but a surface that has sort of a microtexture that spreads out the specular. Index of refraction, IOR, has to do with how it falls off over the surface. So if we turn this to 0, we'll get no specular. If we turn this up higher, then we get a bright, broader specular. Okay, so we can also go into transmission. So transmission has to do with the opacity of the object. So if we start to turn this up, then we can see through the object. Now in the past, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but in the past, to make something transmissive in Arnold, you had to go into the shape node of the object, and under Arnold, you have to turn off opaque for it to treat it like an object through which light can travel. Okay, so you can see this is a pretty noisy render because my render settings are so low, but I'm going to turn those up just a little bit to get rid of some of that noise. So my transmission settings are low. Turn that up to get some better quality. And we might have to turn up our specular settings a little bit too. But you can see that it looks a little bit like sort of a frosted glass or something right now. Now this takes a long time to render, so if you want to render just one area in your render view, you can hold down Shift and click and drag, and it will just preview that area. So let's just stick to that for now. So there's a lot of detail here we can see. So under transmission and under specular, we've got some roughness. So I'm going to turn that down to have sharper to get rid of some of that noise. So under transmission, so we can change the color of the transmission here to make it look like red glass or whatever. Go back to white and it will have no color. You can change the scatter color here. You can see nothing happens until you start to turn up the depth. And this will give you a better representation of a colored see-through object because it depends on the depth of the thickness of the object you're looking at, how much of this color it will get. So let's say you wanted to render something like apple juice. You can give it that kind of orangey, yellowy color. And depending on how you've got the depth set up, it will give you more or less of that color returned to you. Dispersion, Abbe, or whatever this is, kind of breaks up the color, so you can see that it's like there are sort of microfractures or prismatic distortions within. Extra roughness probably is what it sounds like. I don't know how it works. It looks like it's just softening everything up here, so we're losing some of the surface detail. One thing you can do to play around with this is to play with some of these presets here, and we'll look at these in a minute. But that's what transmission does, is it makes something transparent. So I can turn that off. And you'll notice that when I turn this all the way up, when we go back up to base, it has turned down, it made these settings inaccessible. But if you have it partly transmissive, you can have it partly see-through and still have some diffuse, so you can combine the two, which kind of gives you some weird settings. But anyway, so let's turn that back up. Let's turn transmissiveness down, so we're just back to this. But you can see something like transmissive makes rendering much more slow, because it's got to calculate light going through something and refracting and seeing things behind. So there's a lot more to calculate. And the index of refraction that it uses will be whatever you have set here. So we also have subsurface scattering. So we can turn this, let's turn this all the way up. So what subsurface scattering is trying to do is to simulate light going into an object, bouncing around, and then coming back out onto the surface. So first we can give it a color. So if we change the color slightly, that's the color that it's picking up on the inside of the surface. And right now I have my diffuse base set to white, so we're getting all of this color. Now here's where scene scale comes into play. Right now the scale is set to 1, but this is actually a really tiny object in my scene. So if it looks like we're not seeing any surface detail, we may have to turn down this scale to make it act a little more correctly. So this looks a little better to me. You could even make this a little bit smaller. And then we also have radius, and this has to do with how far, if something goes into the surface, the light goes into the surface and it comes back, how far it's going to extend into the shadows. So you can use this to change the degree of subsurface scattering that and how it appears on the surface. Now this color also has to do with how deep how the color is returned, and this is a little confusing, but if we go into R, G, and B, the wavelengths of the colors for red, green, and blue will be different, and the way they travel through the surface will be determined to some degree by how much red, green, and blue that you have. But you can experiment with this a little bit. So let me just give this a different color. It's a little too bright. Just changing to HSV from RGB so I can control these things separately. So I'm trying to make, a material like jade or something where you have a highly reflective surface, but also the light goes in and comes out a little bit. Now, this is pretty low quality, and that again comes down to our samples, which we'll talk about later on. But under the Arnold render tab in the render settings, subsurface scattering is just set to 1 here. So if I just take a snapshot of this and then go in and change this to a much higher value, like 4, for example. You can see already that it's cleaning up a lot of that noise, but the render time is going up. But you can see much better quality, and this is starting to look like a real material, like a semi-translucent plastic or jade or something like that. So jade, let's say we wanted to do that, that actually might have to have some transmissiveness as well, that light actually passes through rather than just bouncing around. So we could go back in here, and I haven't done this, so I don't know how this is going to work, but if we start turning up transmission a little bit and changing that scatter color to kind of a green, Or we could have more of a yellowy green, so it's returning, it's going in and bringing out a bit of yellow color. Now it's taking a long time to render, so I'm just going to select a small area here. Even that takes quite a while to render. And my subsurface scattering samples are up quite high. So subsurface scattering depends on having some diffuse because it has to play out on the surface and not just on a transmissive material. So you can play around with this to try and get it working the way that you want. So with some transmissiveness, you can start seeing through the object a little bit. But if we take a snapshot here, you can just see that's the noise at subsurface scattering samples of 1. This is at subsurface sampling levels at 4. But the render times are much higher. I'm going to turn off transmissiveness just to go back to this. So we can also, let me just select this area here. So that's subsurface scattering. I'm going to turn that off for now. Just go back to this. And then you've got this thing called coat. And this is like a secondary specular. It's as if something was lacquered with a clear varnish or something. So if we take the first specular and let's say make that kind of rough, so it's spread out a little bit more. Oops. And then we can go and turn on the coat. And it will have, so we've got the tight specular now from the coat and the rough specular from the specular settings. So if I turn that off, you can see that we're left with just the coat. And let me change the color of this so it's a little bit easier to see. So the specular is red now. So you can see that's spreading out a little bit more, whereas the coat is the tight one on top. And you can change the index of refraction for the coat versus the specular to get different types of results. Let's turn that off. Let's fix our specular. So just go back to white specular. And then we have emission, so this just makes this thing cast light. So you can use this to cast light into a scene. So it will actually light up surrounding objects, so you can see it's lighting the floor slightly. If you have this turned up all the way, then it starts to overwhelm the form a little bit. This is a way to have something appear like a light source in a scene. But if you just want to highlight something in a scene, it might be better to do it in post, so in After Effects or something, and we'll talk about that later on. So geometry, if we want to add a bump map, we'll talk about this later on too. We can do that here. Thin-walled, if you want to make it look like a thin-walled glass or something like that, or a bubble, then you can use that. So with thin-walled, you can see what it's doing here. It's changing the way it refracts through transmissiveness. So because it's not a solid being treated like a solid object anymore, it's not refracting the background in the same way. If I turn off thin-walled, then it goes back to being more like a solid glass object, and I still have that green color in there. Let me turn that back off again. Matte we'll talk about later on when we talk about compositing, but this has to do with how the alpha channel of this thing is rendered. So up here in the Arnold render view, we've got RGB, and we can go between channels. Since this is just all gray, that the luminosity, the RGB are all the same. And here's alpha. You can get to alpha by pressing on this too, and it just shows that there's nothing in the background. So black means transparent when you bring it into something like Photoshop or After Effects. White means this is where the pixels are with the actual information. Turning on matte actually just gets rid of this. So even though this is confusing, but we'll talk about it more when we get to compositing, you can make this render in a sense, so it can cast shadows into the scene, it can reflect light, its color onto other objects nearby, but if you don't actually want it to appear in the render, you can enable matte. But anyway, we'll talk about that more later on. And then some other stuff here, don't really need to talk about caustics, but you can turn that on if you want to have the refracted, transmitted light, things like that. So the thing to do with the shader is to play around with it, find some real-world material and try and emulate it. And that will have to do with how you light the scene and how you change the shaders. Now, Maya, Arnold 5 in Maya, and the shader has a whole bunch of presets. And so you can just go into the shader, go to preset, and it will give you this drop-down menu. And it's got its own Jade menu option here, so I can just say replace. And it will try to give me something like this. The one thing I've found with these presets is it doesn't automatically override all the settings. So for example, with Jade, I would think it's supposed to have subsurface scattering, but it doesn't by default turn that on. And sometimes things that are meant to be transmissive, unless you have that already turned on here, it's not going to show up. So unless I'm doing something wrong, it seems to be a bit of a limitation with these presets. If we go to, the balloon preset, and it's like a foil balloon. Skin should turn on subsurface scattering, and it seems to, but it doesn't take into account necessarily the scale. I had my scale, I think, set to some value here. It might have changed it, but it might not be the right scale for this scene. So if I change this to 0.1, for example, that might be a better scale for the size of the object here. You can change something like chrome, which will just reflect everything in the scene. There's not much to reflect here because there's only the floor and the light source. It's really noisy scene because our samples are set so low, so all the reflections that are going on to the ground, and those are being reflected back into the chrome. We're getting these little fireflies, these bright spots where the sampling is inadequate to smooth them out, but we'll talk about that more in the next video. So play around with this, try some of these different things, but also look around you, try and emulate some sort of glass, a liquid, emulate some sort of stony material, try and emulate plastic, all sorts of things. Put colors in different areas and see what happens. It rewards experimentation, and in some ways it's the only way to learn. By just playing with these settings, you're quite limited in what you can do. You can get some good basic shaders. What we'll come back to later on is building shader networks, when you start to pipe other utilities into some of these settings to get more subtleties and to break up these colors and things like that. But anyway, the AI standard surface shader is going to be the workhorse for you. So play around with it and see what you can do.